for the invitation. Thanks that I can be here and talk about p-values. As Noah said, I worked several years in research and now nearly 6 years in statistics oncology. And originally, I have studied bioinformatics. So at the end, I'm somehow something between bioinformaticians and statisticians. And therefore, I know a lot of discussions, or I remember a lot of discussions about p-values. And therefore, when Noah came back to me and said, hey, can you make talk? And I thought, okay, yeah, cool. I would like to talk about p-values because that's always a problem and a communication problem. And so let's start a little bit with an example. And then afterwards, I would like to give a very briefly definition and context, and then talk about the American Statistical Association statement on the p-values, and give some alternative methods on p-values which could be used, and also a summary. So let's directly start. We have a research question. It's a research question, do jelly beans cause acne or not? And that's always also in our daily job, the case that we have at the beginning a question, and then afterwards we think about, okay, what we can do. And then when we have an assumption like that, do jelly beans cause acne or not? Then these scientists here thought, okay, let's go ahead and look for the association between those both, and let's test it and look for the p-value. But at the end, they have seen that it was not connected to each other because our p-value was above 0.05 here. And then afterwards, they decided, hey, okay, we cannot here show something, so let's go ahead, because I heard from someone that the colors, the specific color is the reason for that, and not per se these linking, it's the color. And so they starting the subgroup analysis and go ahead with different colors in red and green and so on at the end with 20 tests. And here we have a finding, oh, cool, one of them is definitely below 0.05. It's the green jelly beans. That's the explanation for the association between jelly beans and the acne. These are the green jelly beans. And so what happens? We are going and publish it and make the news ever, the best news, that we have green jelly beans linked to acne, and we have it definitely shown with the green jelly beans. And this is something which often happens in our daily working, because we are doing a lot of tests. And so therefore, it is very, very important to understand p-values and the interpretation of this, to do not report and publish things like our green jelly beans. So therefore, let's start with p-values. Before we go into the definition of the p-values, let's start first. What are the basics which we need? The first thing what we need is hypothesis testing. When we are testing hypothesis, we have a null hypothesis and we have an alternative hypothesis. So that means that we are always looking for the null hypothesis against our alternative hypothesis. This is somehow important to understand, because when we are testing, then we are looking very often for the null hypothesis. That means for the difference between two groups. And therefore, we say at the end as our result that we will either reject the null hypothesis here in favor of the alternative hypothesis, and or retain the or fail to reject the null hypothesis. So from our wording, we should never use except the null hypothesis. Our wording should always be retaining the null hypothesis. And the smaller the p-value, the greater the statistical incompatibility of the data with the null hypothesis. And to show it a little bit more detailed, here, a null hypothesis can be, for example, say we have no difference between compared groups, or we have a difference given between the compared groups. So at the end, this is very important because these hypotheses are needed for the test, because what we are doing with the p-test or the p-value, where we are looking, okay, we have a certain cutoff, these so-called 0.05 significance level. And we are looking, is our p-value below this 0.05 or above? So the p-value is the probability of obtaining test results at least as extreme as the result actually observed, under the assumption that the null hypothesis is correct. If this is unlikely, then we reject the null hypothesis. So that's somehow a cool statement or something which we can read everywhere, but at the end we need to understand what's happening here. And therefore, let's look very quickly to the cross table here. At the end, what we have a reality. And the reality is that our null hypothesis is true or our null hypothesis is false. And then at the other side, we have the decision which we are doing to retain the null hypothesis or to reject the null hypothesis. And here we have two true positives when we have the combination of the null hypothesis is true and we can retain, or the null hypothesis is false and we retain. But nevertheless, what you need to understand is when we're using the p-values, then we have also an error which we are calculating in our analysis. Because when we have a null hypothesis which is true and we reject the null hypothesis, that is very important that we understand that we have a type 1 error in that case. And the type 1 error, this occurs to the null hypothesis, and it is calculated to the significance level and is usually also set to 0.05. So that means the type 1 error and our p-value are directly connected to each other. And so it is equal to our alpha level or to our test level. And what does it mean? But when we have a type 1 error, which we need to care for it, in very basic words, that means that there is a 5% change of rejecting a null hypothesis based on sample data and making a type 1 error or a mistake, a wrong conclusion of what I have observed. And this is very important to understand because the more testing we are doing, the higher is this value or the type 1 error is then getting up. And this is very, very important to understand why we cannot only look for the p-values without thinking about the basics or the reasons behind. So in this context, publications typically contain a lot of multiple p-values, and also they use the wording of significant. And the question here is also, how should we evaluate these values? And is it okay to use frequently this wording significant? So let's go a little bit more ahead and say, okay, we know now something about, we have null hypothesis and we have an alternative hypothesis. These are our questions. We are calculating the p-value by the very arbitrary use cutoff of 0.05. And when we are calculating this, then we have always a type 1 error, which is a problem because this is the chance of doing mistakes. So the next thing, which is very important to understand in this context, is also exploratory versus confirmatory analysis. Why is this important? Exploratory and confirmatory analysis are two types of data analysis that are commonly used in research, especially in clinical research. I would say our daily work. And exploratory analysis discover the patterns or relationships or associations, insights between unknown or unexpected data, which we do not have if we would like, for example, when we have RNA-seq data and we are looking for the 22,000 genes, and we would like to look to have the more expression level genes to select them, then we would use the p-values to get a ranking. But at the end, we would do also a multiple testing approach or an adjustment approach to avoid these type 1 errors. So the exploratory analysis is something which we use for explaining something which we are not really able to explain, where we would like to generate hypotheses, and therefore we use very often visualization, descriptive statistics, exploratory analysis approaches, or clustering, and so on. And this is also a very, very important part. At the other side, we have the confirmatory analysis. And confirmatory analysis means testing hypotheses for evaluation of pre-specified research questions. And that's the most important point here. Confirmatory analysis, for example, phase 3 study. Here we have a pre-specified hypothesis, which is then written down in the analysis plan, where we know, okay, our primary endpoint is the biomarker X epsilon, and we would like to look for the overall survival, and we have an assumption that our hazard ratio will be below 0.76 or something like that. So it is really something which we predefine and would like only to show that it is the right thing which we have assumed in our analysis. Here in this confirmatory analysis, we also make visualization and descriptive statistics, but nevertheless, we also typically use inferential statistics or hypothesis testing methods to determine whether the result which we observed is likely due to chance, or if it is whether they given to a real relationship or effect. Often here we use often used to validate the hypothesis for the exploratory analysis means we start with an exploratory analysis, look, for example, for 5 markers, biomarkers, try to get an impression of these biomarkers, and then afterwards go and see, okay, we have an effect here or an association which we found in our exploratory analysis, and now we can generate a hypothesis and go to the next step and make confirmatory analysis. So for the confirmatory analysis, that means that we have defined number of tests which we are using for showing the effect or the association and so on, the significance. But for the exploratory analysis, we are more or less doing a lot of testing. And we are doing a lot of generating a lot of p-values. And so what is important here? For the exploratory analysis, when we are doing a lot of tests, we are not controlling the type 1 error. But in a confirmatory analysis, we are more controlling the type 1 error because we know, okay, we are using only 1 or 2 tests because we have only 2 hypotheses, which we like to show in our clinical data, for example. And then other thing in this context, which is really important, is multiple testing. So at the end, we have in the publications a lot of p-values which are reported. We have in each of these publications also the wording significance, which is more or less strongly used. And the problem is when we test several hypotheses on the same sample, these increases dramatically the probability of having a false conclusion. And therefore, it is important to adjust for this. So when multiple testings are conducted at the same time, we need to take care of an adjustment, and we need to avoid these kind of things or this increasing type 1 error, that we can be sure at the end this p-value which we are observing here in our data is okay and can be really interpreted as a real association or a real difference or whatever the question was. Because these multiple testings occurs of false positive findings, which can be really misleading and can also result in incorrect conclusions. So let's very, very simply show here what happens when we have and look at for our jelly bean example. When we have a single test, we are testing a single hypothesis for the sample, and we are looking for the type 1 error. And here our example is jelly beans only one test because we combine all the colors together and look for jelly beans have an association with acne. So we have only a probability of false conclusions of 5% because we have the cutoff of 0.05, 5% probability of false conclusion. So what they have done, they have run nearly 20 tests and looked for the different colors. And when we very, very simply would calculate the false positive probability for this conclusion, when we are running 20 tests and find at the end, okay, green, that's the thing which we need, green, that's our explanation for everything in context of jelly beans and acne, then we would have 64% of a probability of a false conclusion. So as you can see here, when we have 20 tests, we have much more higher probability of being wrong with our conclusions. And that's the reason why we have so much reports and publications which are always talking about p-values in context of significant findings. But at the end, it's an exploratory analysis. And that's not okay, because we need to think about what are our hypotheses, which context do we have for our analysis? Is it an exploratory or confirmatory analysis? Because otherwise, here you can see, is it really wrong? And can we believe on that, what we see and read in our publications? No, we need to take care also for the type 1 error. Why we should avoid this word significant? I know typically when we have our exploratory analysis had run, I don't know, 10, 20 tests, when we are using the p-values in a high dimensional, very, very high dimensional context, my experience is that we always do adjusting for that. Then we use the false discovery rate or something like that and adjust for the p-values. But the more problematic point is when we are running, for example, 10 or 20 tests. And my observation is then we do not care anymore about these multiple testing approach. And we are talking about p-values and significances as we have done only one test or something like that. And that's my feeling, what I have observed in the last years, that or during my experiences and during the lots of projects which I have seen, that this is really problematic. And significant diswording or frequent using of significant can lead to problems because it leads to misunderstanding and also misinterpretation. P-values are used as a measure of strength of evidence against a null hypothesis. They do not give an information about the effect size. They do not say something about the importance of the effect. They do not say something about our clinical relevance. And the interpretation of a p-value always depends on study design, sample sizes, statistical assumptions, the context of the research which we have, and so on. So that means that, moreover, the interpretation of a p-value depends on several factors, and we need to take care of them. We need to have an understanding of these different things and discuss it also, that we can really believe in our conclusions and our results. Another point, sure, statistical significance is not clinical relevance. Statistical significance and clinical relevance are both considerations and different concepts in research and data analysis. Statistical significance refers to whether an observation effect or difference in a sample is likely to have occurred by chance or not, typically determined by calculating the p-value. But the clinical relevance is that we are using or looking for the meaning of our results. Does it really make sense? Is this clinically relevant or not? This is the clinical relevance. And even if a result is statistically significant, it may not have a meaningful impact on patient outcomes or clinical decisions making. These are not directly connected to each other. And in 1885, when Edwards originally presented the p-values and the wording of we should use statistical significance, then the idea was to serve it as a tool, this wording of significance, to identify when a result requires further investigation. And however, in the different years, this attention or this purpose getting lost, and nearly 30 years later, Boring et al. Said statistical significance was not intended to imply clinical relevance. And the conflation of both was definitely criticized not to use because it is not given in this context. And so therefore also a lovely side from Altman et al., absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So therefore, please think about statistical significance and talk about it in context of clinical relevance and understand what you're really talking about and what is the idea, what you would like to see. So the first part was only to get an idea. The aim here is from my side not to give a statistical approach and explain the p-values, how to calculate them, and so on. My aim is here to focus on the understanding of p-values, to have a change in mind, and also to get the possibility to think again about p-values. And another statement which is regarding p-values really, really helpful is coming from the American Statistical Association. They have presented or published 2 publications, and I think from my side, very important publications. Please read them and enjoy. The one is that the ASA statement on p-values, context, process, and purpose, and the other in 2019 was moving to world beyond the p-values below 0.05. And overall, the ASA statement encourages researchers to use p-values and other statistical tools appropriately and to interpret their results in the context of their research questions, and also look for the available evidence and not only run all these analyses and catching up the p-values. So let's go a little bit more detailed on their statements, what they have said. Wait a second. Oh, yes, no. The first statement is the magnitude of the p-values. Again, a p-value is not a measure of the size of an effect or the importance of a result, but rather a measure of the strength of evidence against the null hypothesis. This is something definitely which we need to understand. A p-value is providing limited evidence for the alternative hypothesis. It is not indicating the strength of evidence against the null hypothesis. And such kind of things surely can lead to incorrect conclusions and misunderstandings of statistical results. And p-values cannot be used to determine the probability of the hypothesis being true or the probability that the observed data occurred by chance alone. This is really important. And what we need also to understand in this context is a relatively large p-value does not automatically imply that here does not imply evidence in favor of the null hypothesis, because many other hypotheses can be also equal or more consistent with an observed data, which we do not have tested. And what happens if the p-value is very close to 0.05? For example, we have 0.049 or we have 0.051. What does it really mean? Does it mean, okay, we do not anymore report these values? Does it mean we do not anymore discuss these values because we are looking only for this cutoff of 0.05 and make a black and white decision of, okay, yes, no, it works or not? This does not make sense. So therefore, the decision to reject or not reject the null hypothesis may also depend on other factors like study design, the effect sizes, the sample sizes, the quality of the data, very, very important point, and also the scientific context. Not only make the decisions on only the p-values. And so we come to the next statement, the over-reliance of the p-values. Because p-values are very, very often used as the sole criterion for a decision-making, this black and white decision. And as said, what happens when we have 0.049 or 0.051? And so we need to be aware of this can lead to false positives. We have false negatives. We have incorrect conclusions. So think about and bring your p-value more in the context of other factors to make your decisions. Not only use the p-values and talk about significance. You need more than this to show real differences and also to make beneficial conclusions. So scientific conclusions should not be made solely based on whether a p-value passes a certain threshold or not. The third very important point from the ASA statement is reporting. Reporting bias, lack of reproducibility, these cherry picking of scientists, of our daily work, I would say, of these values which we would like to report and which not. But reproducibility is a fundamental principle of scientific research. And this is very, very important when we have findings that we are able to validate them and it is something which we can show again. And therefore, the ASA statement writes that they have concerns about the reproducibility of the research findings because the findings always or heavily rely on the p-values. That means that we are selecting only, okay, which results does make to show because they are above the p-value cutoff of 0.05 or not. And when studies cannot be reproduced, it can raise doubts about the accuracy and the generalizability of the original results. And so we cannot really anymore trust the publications. And lack of reproducibility can be diverse, for example, including issues related to experimental design or data analysis, publication bias, multiple comparisons, scientific misconduct, and so on. So therefore, please be transparent. Please be open. Please be being modest to show your results and also to discuss it with other scientists because it helps. Also, a finding which is not above 0.05 can be very helpful in a very early phase to think about next hypotheses to test and also next conclusions we need to take because this is also a finding. And so a very, very important point from my perspective. Okay, we have talked now about not to do's, so what we should not do, and but how we should work. Do we now avoid all p-values, never talk about significance, and so on? No, this is something which we cannot really do. So therefore, we have also many do's in our daily work. It's not only avoid these things we need. I think from my perspective, the first very, very important point is to accept the uncertainty of this p-value. And when we have an awareness of that, then we can be also thoughtful, we can be open to discuss the findings, to have better communications, to make research in context of our knowledge and also of our question, which we would like to show. And so in that context, we need also alternative methods. And alternative methods can really help to use the p-values and in the context and also interpret them in the right way. Which alternative methods can it be? For example, effect size. Effect sizes are very, very important, especially in clinical research. Effect sizes are measures of the magnitude of the difference or relationship between variables independent of sample size. Effect sizes are more informative than p-values and can provide more information about the clinical significance or the clinical relevance. And which kind of effect sizes do we have? And I think the best example, which we always use also in context of clinical research, can be, for example, odds ratios or hazard ratios. Because as an example, when you're looking for a Kaplan-Meier curve, you have two curves, and you would like now to explain if they have a difference, if you can see differences in your Kaplan-Meier curves or not, and you calculate the p-value by a commonly used test, log-rank test, and report it. Does it really help when someone in a publication reads this p-value? No, it does not really provide the information that we need for understanding of our data. For the understanding, we need the hazard ratios. We need to understand where are our estimates to make a more conclusive decision. And also in this context, when we use these several approaches for the effect sizes like Cohen's, the Pearson's correlation coefficient, R-squares, odds ratios, hazard ratios, then in this context, we especially also need the confidence intervals. It's not only that we are looking for our specific estimate of the hazard ratios, we need also the confidence intervals, which show us where is the range of my data. And is it a huge range or is it a small range? Is it something which I can trust or not? So effect sizes and also confidence intervals does really help when we report p-values in this context to make clinical relevance conclusions. A confidence interval is a range of values around an estimated parameter, which, for example, is then a mean proportion or a regression coefficient that contain the true value of the parameter, which with a specified level of confidence, the typically used 95% confidence interval. P-values and confidence intervals are complementary. That is really important. Complementary types of statistical concepts both provide information about reliability of statistical estimates. So please, when you would like to use your p-values, then report also effect sizes and also the confidence intervals, because then everyone can better understand the data and make better conclusions, which really helps. Very quickly to go further on, sure, we have a lot of different things which we can use in context of p-values, but for the completeness, I need also to mention the Bayesian methods that are based on the probability theory and needs also prior knowledge to and the Bayesian methods provide posterior probabilities of the hypothesis. And the limitations here are that we need a specification of a prior distribution, and it might require also additional setups for the analysis which we are running here. But really helps in incorporation of prior knowledge. That means when we have learnings from other data that we can conclude and put them also into this method. And it can also provide evidence for the null hypothesis. It is more flexible, can also provide a more complete picture of the uncertainty associated with the estimates of the parameter. And so therefore, these are also advantages here. But I think in your context, Noah, you are using them more than we. Sure, resampling methods. We had a lot of methods also with high dimensional data analysis and AI approaches. And something like, for example, resampling methods that we are using bootstrapping and permutation tests, and non-parametric methods that rely on sampling from the observed data to estimate the sampling distribution of the other data. And here the advantages are that it is more robust to violation of normality and can provide more accurate estimates. And also resampling methods do not really require that variables follow a normal distribution, and also can be more accurate in practice than classical methods, and are very similar for different statistics so that we can really interpret these results. This is also a possibility to use in context of p-values to understand our p-values better and our interpretation. So now we are here at the end, and first let's summary the talk. P-value is not a measure of the size of an effect or the importance of a result, but rather a measure of the strength of evidence against a null hypothesis. Second thing, p-values can be affected by sample size, and that a small p-value does not necessarily imply a large effect size. Considerations for evaluating p-values are definitely reproducibility, replicability, multiple comparisons, effect sizes, study design, assumptions, context. Scientists should always use also other measures to, like, confidence intervals, effect sizes, or other methods additionally to p-values to understand our data better. And also one of the most important things, call for greater transparency in reporting our statistical analysis, including a full description of the methods and use the assumptions that have been made. And so at the end, I would like to say, let us avoid together findings like green jelly beans and publish them. I think what we can here definitely all together do is find the right or the same language between the different stakeholders, talk to each other, understand really what are the assumptions, which kind of data do we have here, and what is my question? What is what I would like to show at the end? And so if we also represent all that what we have done and discuss it and show also findings which are not below p 0.05, then I really believe that we can be successful in our scientific work and make better and clinically more relevant conclusions. So thanks, and I'm really looking forward for the discussion, for your view of p-values and getting an impression of your statements, and also some questions.